Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové, vítejte v Dominikánské 8 na přednášce vzácného hosta z Telavivské univerzity Odeta Lipšice, kterého tady vítám, welcome. Tuto přednášku, která bude v angličtině, ale máte překlad nebo aspoň souhrn a bude spoustu obrázků, takže se nemusíte bát. Pořádáme, a to je velkou radostí, s Evangelickou teologickou fakultou Univerzity Karlovy, kterou tady reprezentuje Filip Čapek, který bude taky dnešní debatu uvádět a moderovat a důkladněji nám představí i našeho hosta. Jako obvykle bude asi hodinová přednáška a pak čas na diskuzi. A máme taky tu čest uvítat mezi námi vzácnou návštěvu, a tou je izraelská velvyslankyně její excelence paní madam Anna Azari. Welcome, excellency. Děkuji, že jste přišli a rád předávám slovo moderátorovi dnešního večera.
Dobrý večer. Nejdříve představím hosta, pak řeknu pár dalších věcí, které s dnešním dnem souvisí. Odet Lipšic, se kterým se znám dlouhá léta, je profesorem v Institutu archeologie na Univerzitě Tel Aviv, kde byl 13 let ředitelem tohoto institutu a nyní, nebudeme říkat, že postoupil níž, ale spíš vystoupal výše, je součástí Institutu pokročilých studií, kde se snaží poznatky archeologie nějakým způsobem rozšířit o poznatky a možnosti přírodních věd, včetně myonové analýzy a podobných věcí. 3 základní výzkumy podniká a vede. Prvním byl výzkum v Ramat Rachel blízko Jeruzaléma v letech 2005 až 2010. Další výzkum kratší, který byl ukončen, byl kolem toho známého místa Tel Moca s chrámem v blízkosti Jeruzaléma v letech 2019 až 2023. A ten nejdelší výzkum se započal v roce 2010 při terénním výzkumu a potom od roku 2011 až do přítomnosti ve starověkém pevnostním městě, které se jmenuje Tel Azeka, které bylo osídleno po 4000 let. Důležité je, že se veškerých těchto 3 výzkumů může účastnit i Univerzita Karlova a Evangelická teologická fakulta, ovšem ne výhradně, protože s námi jezdí i kolegové a studenti z jiných fakult Univerzity Karlovy. Měl bych také říct, že tady není jenom Odet, ale i jeho manželka Jael, kterou vítáme mezi námi a jsme rádi, že je zde mezi námi. Téma, o kterém bude řeč, je Jeruzalém v mýtu a ve skutečnosti, kde se tím pádem, jak uvidíte, prolnou 2 kompetence našeho milého hosta, a sice znalost archeologie a také důkladná práce s biblickými texty, což si myslím, že je něco, co na tomto místě, když zazní i v kontextu této budovy a té přednáškové řady, co pořádá Dominikánská 8, je něco důležitého a myslím si, že je to i velkým přínosem. Tady to téma Jeruzalém, mýtus versus skutečnost nebo askutečnost. K dispozici, kdo byste chtěli, jsou ty pracovní překlady, kdy se podařilo ze 16 stránek hutného PowerPointu, jak uvidíte, vytvořit 4 stránky, tak doufám, že se to setká snad s úspěchem a porozuměním. A poslední věc, co bych rád řekl, je poděkování místním Dominikánské 8 z důvodu, že naše Evangelická teologická fakulta podniká kompletní rekonstrukci a není způsobila hostit takovéto setkání. Takže za to moc děkujeme, že můžeme být tady a to je skoro poslední věc. A ještě důležitější věc jsem zapomněl zmínit je to, že ta přednáška dnes není první, ale druhá, protože už menší, taková trošku specializovanější proběhla na naší fakultě. Ale ten výlet do Prahy kolegy Lipšice nebyl náhodný, ale souvisí s tím, že mu zítra bude udělen čestný doktorát Univerzity Karlovy. Takže to je ta hlavní příčina a důvod a i výsledek té naší dlouhodobé spolupráce. Takže to je tak na úvod a teď předávám slovo našemu milému hostovi.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and to speak a little bit about Jerusalem. I can just start by telling you that I live all my life in the land of Israel. And since I was very young, I was fascinated not only by the history of this land, and not only by the biblical literature, the Bible, that was written and was created in this land by people who lived there, but especially I was fascinated in trying to find information about these people who wrote the Bible. Who they were, what did they want to convey to the people who lived near them in the same time, and what should we find in this text? And I find myself trying to look for the history of these people who wrote the Bible. And archaeology is a very good way to find all the information that we can about these people, and then to take this information from the land, from this ground, from the archaeology, and put it back in front of the Bible and ask, okay, how it relates, what we have from the ground, what we have from the text, and how we can deal with it. And Jerusalem, as you can see here, is maybe the best example to the gap, to the difference between the actual Jerusalem and Jerusalem that is in the text. The problem is not with the text, and the problem is not with the information that we have from the ground. Because the people that used to live in the time that the Bible was written, they knew what is the fact. They saw Jerusalem in their own eyes. The problem is in many cases with us today, who take the biblical text and look for something higher than it was. So I hope that many of you will not be so disappointed from what I want to say today about Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is Jerusalem. But you should see and you should understand in a few minutes on what I'm going to speak about, that most of the text was written in times that Jerusalem was very poor. Jerusalem was very small. And the Bible was written in the time that people lived in the ruins of Jerusalem, looking at the ruins on the destruction and think about Jerusalem that was before, and waiting for Jerusalem that will be in the future. So it's a kind of intermediate time between two glorious periods in the history of Jerusalem. The actual glory of the past and the hopes for the glory of the future. So I'm going to start slowly, and I will see when people feel, a little bit, and then maybe I will give some more explanation of the text that Philip translated for you according to the slide that I'm going to present. I want to start with some introduction on how I understand the text. The historiographical account on the history of Israel, now embedded within the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, was intended for the generation for which it was composed, not for us. It was intended to convey the ideological message to the people of that generation that the text was written, especially to the Jerusalem elite who lived in Jerusalem at that time. It was a text written by the same elite for the same Jerusalem elite. based on the sources and the history that was known to that same elite and to that same people in Jerusalem at that time, not for us. The historians who composed this ancient historiographical work didn't intend to describe what was the history of Judah or history of Israel and Judah, but to explain the historical chain of events and to explain why Judah and Jerusalem are where they are at the same time when the history was written. So it's a moral text, not a historical text. It was historiographical text intended to explain the history rather than historical literature intended to describe the history. In this lecture, I would like to demonstrate the big gap between what we know from the biblical account and what we can reconstruct from other sources, mainly from archaeology. I will focus on Jerusalem and will try to demonstrate that there is no connection between the earthly city, the actual city that was there in biblical time, and between its image in the biblical text. The problem is not with the biblical descriptions. The problem is with the attempts of historians and archaeologists to reconstruct the biblical history and the ancient reality based on this very ideological and religious description. I would like to start with presenting two gaps concerning Jerusalem as a symbol and in reality. The first gap is between the reality of the first and mainly second temple, pre-Roman, pre-Herod the Great, city of Jerusalem, and between the biblical image of the city reflected in the biblical descriptions of Jerusalem. The biblical descriptions were mostly written in periods when Jerusalem was small and poor and described a mythical city that was mainly based on longing to ancient times and on hopes for the renewal of this mythical past in the future. The second gap is between the actual finds from Jerusalem and between modern scholarly historical interpretation and reconstructions of the city of Jerusalem in the first and second temple before Herod, the pre-Roman periods, that are mainly based on these biblical late and unreal descriptions of the city, together with some other late reflections on the way Jerusalem was built and shaped in the Roman period, and reflecting this late situation of the city on earlier periods in its history. You will see the details very soon. It seems to me that most scholars dealt with pre-Herodian Jerusalem consciously or unconsciously follow the biblical descriptions and describe the city of Jerusalem in a very different way than the actual facts that we have on the ground. The combination of glorious Jerusalem in the Roman period, in the time that Herod the Great built it, and the biblical mythical descriptions of the city caused scholars of our generation to reconstruct a city that was never existed. Jerusalem that is far away from the hard facts, both biblical and archaeological. In this lecture, I would like to summarize the two sides of the picture. Jerusalem of the biblical descriptions on the one hand, and the real Jerusalem as we see it based on archaeological finds on the other. I think that these two Jerusalems that cannot be connected, the symbolic one and the real one, were never meant to meet. neither when most of the biblical descriptions were written, when the city was small and very poor, nor when modern reconstructions regarding the city were created. Make it clear. Pre-Roman Jerusalem was never something like the city of Babylon, the New York of this, or the Prague of the Czech Republic. And maybe not even the edifice or palace that we excavated in Ramat Rachel, very close to Jerusalem. This is much more glorious than Jerusalem was ever. There was public and even monumental architecture in the city of Jerusalem, and it was far above the other very small villages and small hamlets and very agricultural places in Judah. But Jerusalem was never a very glorious city. The unique and important find that we have in Jerusalem are administrative and scribal, because in this city, most of the administration, the priests, the scribes, were centered. Recently, we even have some new finds, and I will speak later also about these finds, that we can see the late period in the history of Jerusalem. These finds are Tel Aviv excavation in Jerusalem, that just in the last year were excavated. And we have here the actual destruction caused by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians in the 9th of Av. So this is the burning and destruction of Jerusalem, very close to the Temple Mount, that of Jerusalem in its glorious days. This is the end of the first temple period, Jerusalem. We can see here nice architecture of nice buildings. We can see that the people had nice vessels made of stone. We can see that these people had nice houses. Here you can see the actual beams of the floors of the second floor and the actual floor that was collapsed from the second floor. You can see here the actual plan of the house with a nice cellar of in the lower part and the nice house that was above it. But again, it's neither so fantastic things like, you can think about Jerusalem. And this is the most amazing time in one of the nice houses of the priests living in Jerusalem, because we actually know who was there. In this house, we found the actual seals of the people. We found many bulle. In a minute, I will explain what is a bulle and why it's so important, these things. So we know the names of the people. Some of them we know from the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem with these people. So we know the names and we know the people. And we can see the script of these people. This is the Hebrew that the Bible was written in this time, not the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew script that we have today. And we have many seals and we have many bulle, and the importance of it for us is very important, because what you see here is a very small lumps of mud that people used and seal it with their own seals. And here you can see the names of the scribes who seal it. Now, why it's so important? Because these bulle, with these names of, for example, Shaphan the scribe, the guy who was a scribe in the time of King Josiah and probably was responsible for parts of the biblical literature that he wrote. So the bulla was sealed, and in the lower part of the bulla, we have scrolls. So these bullas were sealing scrolls of written material, biblical scrolls. And when we have bulla like this, it means that the people in these houses had scrolls, that they wrote the scrolls. Now, when we have this bulla, in the other side of it, you can see the sign of the papyri, or the leather of the scrolls in the other side of it. And we can understand that these scrolls were rounded, and then people took them, and then people sealed the scrolls in order to keep it. And when we have it, it means that the text of the Bible were written in these houses. Now, the first temple as well as a second one that was built in the early Persian period, were ideologically important, central, and the place where many biblical events took place. This is where the Bible was written, but it was small and poor, no more than a small town or a village of few dozens priests and other temple servants living around the small temple with their families. I want to start with an introduction to the geography of Jerusalem and different parts that we have in actual Jerusalem of the biblical time, and we can learn what was the size of the city and what we, as well as the ancient people who lived in the city, could know about it. So this is Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, what you can see is that the eastern border of the city is with the Kidron Valley. This is something that we know, and this is something that everyone who lived in Jerusalem knew it, as I will show you in a minute when we'll start reading the biblical text. The Kidron Valley is the eastern part of Jerusalem. In the western part, we have another valley who called the Tyropeon. And this is the valley that borders Jerusalem from the west. In the upper part of Jerusalem, we have what we have now, the Temple Mount. Below the Temple Mount, what we have is the Ophel. In Hebrew, it means to climb up from the city of David. Now, when people came to Jerusalem 100 and even 200 years ago, this is Jerusalem that they saw. They saw the Temple Mount above, they saw the city of David below, and they created in their mind the Jerusalem that they believed that was in the first and in the second temple. Now it's very problematic, because in no ancient city there was such a big complex of a temple over all the city from above it. And as I will show you later, in all the cities of the ancient world, we have on the top of the city, we have the city itself, because the main thing that people needed is to protect themselves and to have a wall around the upper side of the city. Only in the Roman period, when Herod the Great wanted to build this huge complex of the temple, he built this huge thing. It's not representing the actual original Jerusalem, and this is something that I will try to claim in a few minutes. But this is Jerusalem as we see, this is Jerusalem as scholars saw from the first people who came to Jerusalem in the 19th century. Now, this is a very small hill. You can see it, the round circle. This is a very small hill that no more than about 200 families, maybe 250 families can live. It means that on this region, this area of Jerusalem, maximum 1,000 people can live. This is the size of Jerusalem. It's not Prague. It's a very small, even not neighborhood in Prague. 1,000 people can live here. Now, it's a very steep and small area, very hard to climb from the east or from the west, and it's very, very small. And this is the first thing that I want you, I don't know how many of you were in Jerusalem or visited ancient Jerusalem, but it's a very, very small place. And again, 1,000 people, it means 200 to 250 men can live in this area. Now, if you see this geographical map, you can see how steep is it. This is the Temple Mount. You can even see, if you see the modern walls around it. This is the city of David, and you can see how steep it is and how houses can be, no more than 200 to 250 houses, and how steep valleys you have to the east and to the west of it. So it cannot be expanded anymore. This is what we have today. We call it the Western Hill of Jerusalem. Today, this is a place of the Jewish quarter and the Armenian quarter. And people understood that when Jerusalem needed to grow up, so people moved from the city of David, from this small reach, to this area. But excavation in this area, especially after 1967 war, when all the Jewish quarter was all destroyed and before they rebuilt it again, many excavations were conducted here, and only few remains from the ancient times were found in all this place. So it was clear that Jerusalem was never too big, that Jerusalem was never a place of thousands of people. They were never found. So this reconstruction of Jerusalem, of a small city of David with about 200 houses maximum, and a place that you are climbing to the Temple Mount, this is the reconstruction, the acceptable reconstruction by many scholars from, I would say, from the last 100 years. This is how they reconstruct Jerusalem. The only thing that I need to add to is that you have no any other source of water in Jerusalem beside this small spring called the Gihon spring. This is the only source of water, and we have some jokes about students, that students like water, you will always find them in the lower part, never high, because water will also always go from the low. So even if people built the city on the high hill, the water was also always outside the city. And this is a problem. But as I will explain later, it's a problem for every city in the ancient Near East. And this is the reconstruction of Jerusalem. And this is, again, the maximum way that I can describe Jerusalem in the time of King Hezekiah, in the time of King Josiah, that you see here the city of David, the original city, the Temple Mount above. And when people needed to have more place, they went to the Western Hill, again, today the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, and they lived in this area. Okay? There is one problem with this reconstruction. As I will show you later, Jerusalem is the most excavated place in the world. No other place was excavated so much as Jerusalem. And when I started to think about Jerusalem, I had one main problem that was a key to the idea that I'm going to present today. After so many excavations, people found the city wall on the eastern side of the city of David here. Never a wall was found in the western part of the city of David here. Never. So many excavations, also by Tel Aviv University, was done here. Never there was a wall here. And it was the first problem that I started to think maybe all this reconstruction is problematic. Maybe we should think in a different way about ancient Jerusalem. When we are talking about Jerusalem of, let's say, 100 years ago, and this is the Temple Mount, and this is the old city of Jerusalem, this is the Western Hill that I just saw you, and this is the city of David, the yellow egg. This is the place of biblical Jerusalem. This is the place of 250 people who lived here in Jerusalem with their families. And this is the maximum settlement that can be here in Jerusalem. So, in the following few minutes, I would like to separate in a very strict way between the biblical side of the picture and the archaeological side of it. And even if it seems natural to start with the heartfelt of archaeology, I would like to start with a short overview on Jerusalem in the Bible, and maybe to surprise you a little bit about what we actually can get from Jerusalem, from the Bible, concerning Jerusalem. So, a very small sketch, I can tell you that. Jerusalem appears in the Hebrew Bible 667 times, from the book of Joshua to the book of Chronicles. By the way, in the Pentateuch, you will never find Jerusalem. The name Yevus, which is the ancient name of Jerusalem before David conquered it, appears 41 times, in 25 cases as one of the ancient people of Canaan, one of the ancient pre-Israeli nations of Canaan, but in 16 times as the ancient name of Jerusalem, or as the name of the people who dwelt there before it was conquered by David. The city of David, the name, the city of David, was mentioned 44 more times in the Hebrew Bible. So all in all, beside the many unique other names and titles of the city, among them the most famous name of the city, which is Zion, which appear 154 times, nearly only in the prophetic literature and in Psalms, and only 4 times in the historical books. There are, all in all, 711 occasions that Jerusalem appeared in the Bible. Now, the result from these statistics is that Jerusalem appears 157 times in the Deuteronomistic literature, so Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, describing Jerusalem of the first temple period, and 186 times in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the prophets who actually lived in Jerusalem in the end of the first temple period, and always in connection to the same period of the late 7th century, early 6th century. It means that 343 times Jerusalem was mentioned in connection with the first temple period, and we can add to it 169 times in Chronicles, most of them in parallel to the books in Samuel and Kings. All this will bring the number of the references to Jerusalem in connection with the first temple period to 512 times from 711 times in general. Okay, it's a nice number. Now we can start checking the facts. Most of the other mentions are in the prophet Zechariah, Ezra and Nehemiah, for this early second temple mention of Jerusalem. And it means that beside it, we have mainly the references to Jerusalem in the Psalms and, in the literature. The number of the time of Jerusalem you can see here, in the slide. From these appearances, Jerusalem appears 31% in Jeremiah, in prophetical thing. 31% in the book of Kings, 22% in Samuel. So we can start looking what information we have in all these many appearances. Do we have real information about Jerusalem? So from all this, beside ideology, beside myth, beside all kinds of, general description or the pre-Davidic times, the question is what we actually know from the biblical descriptions on Jerusalem. Can we have, any real information in the biblical description from the people who actually lived there? So, we have some obvious information on the geography of Jerusalem that now you also know because you could see it in the slides here. For example, we know from the Bible that the city is above the Gihon spring. Okay, we know it. The ancient people knew it. So every time that they want to speak about the Gihon, they say that they are going down from the city to the Gihon. Okay, we know it. We can map it. The Kidron, remember the Kidron, which is the eastern side of the city? So the Kidron, they know that the Kidron is the eastern border of the city. And if you cross the Kidron, you go out from the city. Okay, we know it. The ancient people knew it. We can start thinking about it, of course. The Milo, probably the citadel that was built in the middle between the city of David and the Ophel, is a large foundation that they describe in the biblical description, but okay, we know it's part of the geography. The building of the palace and the temple and the city was assigned to Solomon, so everyone knew that if you're talking about the citadel in the middle, and if they are talking about the Ophel, and if they are talking about the temple, they assigned all these structures to Solomon. Is it real or not? Who knows? But this is the biblical description in many different cases. And we know about the house of David within the city, and about Solomon's house and the houses of the forest of Lebanon, and the detailed description about different buildings. But people who lived in Jerusalem, they knew these buildings. And these buildings, today we cannot know for sure what are these buildings, but we know that the main buildings of the kings of Jerusalem and of the wives of the kings of Jerusalem were in Jerusalem, and they knew to describe them and they knew to assign them. Now, we also have many gates, maybe even too many gates in the wall of Jerusalem that are described in the Bible, in the biblical description, usually without any details, usually without any further information, but of probably people who lived in Jerusalem, they knew what is the meaning of the different gates that we had in Jerusalem. And there are some unclear clues regarding the history of Jerusalem and the fortification. For example, there is in Isaiah a clue about you counted the buildings in Jerusalem and tore down houses to strengthen the wall. So he's talking about a wall that was built on destruction of houses. And actually in some of the excavations, they found a wall, you can see here the wall, that was built above houses that were evacuated and destroyed. So probably they knew what they're talking about, but again, we find it, and probably, in archaeology and history, what can we do with it? And there are parts in Jerusalem that we can speculate about their location, like the Mishneh. They're talking about people, important people, who lived in a place called the Mishneh, the second quarter. The second quarter. So, okay, there was a second quarter and important people lived there, but can we make out of it any historical reconstruction of something about Jerusalem? We have clues about the water system in the Kidron, and we know about the garden of Uzzah, a garden that was in Jerusalem that in some cases, some of the burial places were moved of the city of David, of the king of David, were moved to this place. And we even know about places that we know nothing about them. So people in Jerusalem, they knew what it means, but we cannot know what is the meaning of this strange place that is described here. They came up to Jerusalem and stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. Okay, probably they knew what we're talking about. All these descriptions were written by Jerusalemites, by Jerusalemite scribes for Jerusalemite people who knew these places very well. They didn't need to give them more details about what is in Jerusalem. What in all this is making the city of Jerusalem so special? We should remember that these descriptions are reflecting the actual Jerusalem of the first temple period, and that the situation in the second temple period was much harder. The city was smaller and poorer, and even these public structures and the city wall, the gates and the towers were not there anymore, at least not in their actual original way. This brings me to my previous statement. Most of the biblical description of Jerusalem are not connected to the actual real city. They were written by those who were deported from it to Babylon and by those who lived there in the period when it was faint shadow of the glorious past. The priests and Levites on the second temple period lived in a ruined place that for them it was a faint shadow of the glorious past and the source for their hopes for the future glory. The image of the city in the Lamentations and in the Psalms has no connections to earthly Jerusalem, to the actual city. But this description of the city fixed the image of Jerusalem in the memory of the nation. Should historians of our generation and archaeologists of our generation look in their research for this glorious image or for the real Jerusalem? It really depends on what they are looking for. And with this in mind, let's move to archaeology and to the myth that archaeologists, again, my colleagues, are creating based on the myth of the biblical ancient authors. And my claim to my friends, the archaeologists, is that when they're coming to dig in Jerusalem, unlike when we're coming to dig in our site in Azekah, they're coming with the biblical descriptions in the back of their minds. They're not looking for the actual facts on the ground. They are looking for the glorious Jerusalem that they read in the Bible. And they're looking for a city that was never existed. Ancient Jerusalem is the most excavated city in the world, as I told you. especially the around 6 hectares, 60 dunams, ridge that we called it the city of David. That conventional wisdom, the conventional explanation in archaeology regards as the original mound of Jerusalem. And again, no other place in the world was excavated so intensively like Jerusalem. Excavation in many parts of the ridge has proven that during nearly 2,000 years, between the Middle Bronze Age around 1800 BC and the Roman times around 100 BC to 100 AD, this site was fully occupied only in 2 relatively short periods. So the city of David, the place that archaeologists claim that this is original Jerusalem, was actually settled only in 2 short periods. In the Iron Age 2 BC, as we called, so it means between the mid-8th century, from the time of King Ahaz, Hezekiah, to the Babylonian destruction in 586 BCE. So from, let's say, 730, 740 BCE to 586 BCE. And in the late Hellenistic period, from the time of the Hasmonean kings, let's say mid-2nd century BC, to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So in 2,000 years, from the 2nd millennium BC to around 0, this place was settled for 150 years at the end of the First Temple period, and around 150 to 200 years at the end of the Second Temple period. And in most other periods, it was not settled. Many excavations, it's not, a random find. This presented scholars with a problem regarding periods for which there is either textual documentation or circumstantial evidence for significant occupation in Jerusalem. For example, we have texts from the period of El Amarna, 14th century BC, that we have letters from the king of Jerusalem to the Pharaoh of Egypt. So we have nothing here from the time of these letters where the king of Jerusalem wrote letters to the Pharaoh in Egypt. From the time of David and Solomon, the legendary kings who founded the kingdom of Judah, we have nothing in the city of David, nearly nothing in the city of David. So what's going on? From the Persian period, from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, from the time that they rebuilt the Second Temple, we have nothing, nearly nothing, in the ridge of the city of David. So what can we do with it? So where is Jerusalem of most of the historical periods in the long history of this place? In a paper that I wrote in 2011, together with my colleague Israel Finkelstein and with my student Ido Koch, we raised the possibility that, unlike most of what scholars are thinking about Jerusalem, and similar to other sites all over the ancient Near East, the Mount of Jerusalem was located on the summit of the ridge, in the center of the area that was boxed in the time of Herod the Great, and I will explain about it later. And what we think is that the unique structure that was built by Herod the Great surrounded the top of the hill that the ancient city was built. I want to explain it, and then I will actually show you, and I will tell you. In all the cities in the world, in the ancient world, people came and looked for the place that they can surround themselves with a wall and protect themselves. In all the cities in the world, Azekah, that we excavate, Hebron, Lachish, Shechem, all the places in the world were built on the top of the mound. And usually I'm coming to my friends who are excavating Jerusalem and saying, what? Already in the Middle Bronze Age, a Canaanite came to Jerusalem, looked at the place and said, I will not build my house on the top of the hill where I can protect myself, because in 1,000 years, there will be someone like Solomon who will come to build a temple there, so I will not build my house here. I will build my house somewhere else. It cannot be. And what we thought is that, like in every other city, Jerusalem was also built on the top of the mount. Not, as you see here, in the city of David. We should remember that from the strategic point of view, a town covering the southeastern hill would have been indefensible without commanding the top of the ridge, the Temple Mount. So this reconstruction that most scholars reconstruct Jerusalem cannot be accepted. You cannot protect yourself in this way. So if you build your city down here, where people call the city of David, and not on the top of the hill, you are totally unprotected. It's not logic. And I think that, again, scholars in the last 100 years came to Jerusalem. They saw the situation of modern day, that you have the Temple Mount with the mosques there, where the second Herodian temple was, and say, okay, this was probably a situation in Jerusalem from the beginning to the end. I don't think so, and this is what I'll try to show you. All major ancient towns in the central hill country and in the world were located on relatively small mounds, always on the top of the mount, always, like this. Why not reconstruct a situation that also the ruling compound of Iron Age Jerusalem, the first temple Jerusalem, the temple and the palace of the Davidic kings were also always located also on the top of the Temple Mount, below the Herodian complex. But scholars seem to evaluate Iron Age Jerusalem with the notion of the Herodian Temple Mount and current what we call Haram el-Sharif, the mosque that we have there, in mind. In Herodian times, when the city covered a very large area of about 180 hectares, the Temple Mount featured substantial open areas somewhat similar to the situation today in the mosques. Yet, there is no reason to telescope this situation back to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. This is not a normal situation for ancient cities before. Bronze Age city-states in the Levant were the hub of territorial entities. They were always on the top of the mounds, surrounded by a wall, and accommodated a palace, a temple, and other buildings which served the bureaucratic apparatus, as well as residential quarters for the ruling class. Most members of other sectors of the society lived in smaller settlements in their hinterland. Jerusalem probably looked the same. The Temple Mount must have accommodated the temple, the palace, other buildings related to the administration of the kingdom, as well as habitation quarters for the kingdom's bureaucrats. One should not envision large open spaces in its midst in the early phases of the temple. How big could have been a mound located under the Temple Mount of Herod, under the Haram el-Sharif of modern days? Had there been such a mound, the huge construction project which had taken place on the Temple Mount of the Herodian time included major leveling operation and must have eradicated much of its. You can see here the basic plan of the Herodian palace, how they just build the walls. This is the western wall, if you go today to the western wall. This is the southern wall. They just build walls around this ancient top of the mount, and they build this flat, ramp on it. And what we think that it's covering the complete city that was there before. And the Herodian platform that you see here, it covers an area of about 470 meters on 280 meters. It's about 13 hectares, 130 dunams. This is taking down 50 to 60 meters on each side to account for the paucity of Bronze and Iron Ages, as well as the Persian I can see that people started to be nervous with what I'm saying. Or it's a sign of God, something. So also from the Persian Hellenistic pottery around, one gets a mound of around 350 meters on 180 meters. That is an area of about 5 hectares. Equivalent to the size or bigger than most of the other cities in the ancient Levant that we have today. It's bigger than Azekah. It's bigger than Lachish. It's bigger than many other cities. And according to this reconstruction, an ancient mound of Jerusalem was completely trapped under the Herodian platform. Such a mound would well defended topographically on almost all sides by the steep slope of the Kidron Valley from the east, by the relatively steep slope of the Tyropeon to the west, and by the steep slope of the valley of Bethsaida under the northeastern sector of the current Temple Mount in the northeast. The vulnerable sides would be the northwest and the south. In the northwest, a moat must have been cut in the saddle which separates the hill from the continued ridge. And you know the surprise is that when in the end of the 19th century, British scholars came to check the Haram el-Sharif area, they didn't understand why they find a shaft and a cut in the rock of this area. And if you go today to Rockefeller Museum, you see below the wall of the Turkish times, you see this cut on the other side. So actually, it was there, but people didn't see it. The natural rock that you can see here, around and inside the Temple Mount, was already exposed in the 19th century within the Haram el-Sharif compound. A big artificial trench was exposed there with 2 ditches, one to the north of the Temple Mount and another inside its limits. The latter is a 6 meters ditch that disconnects the Temple Mount from the ridge. If one envisioned the temple on the highest point of the hill, the ruling compound could have been located on the edge of the ancient mount in approximately 1/3 of the site in its northwestern sector, with the palace possibly behind the temple. This leaves the entire southern and eastern part of the hill for the rest of the city, for the people who live there. According to this proposal, during the 2nd millennium and the early 1st millennium BCE, during most of the time of Jerusalem, until the great territorial expansion of Jerusalem in the Iron Age to be, in the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, as well as during most of the second half of the 1st millennium after 586 BCE, the destruction, and until the late Hellenistic period, Jerusalem had been located on the mount, which was later leveled and boxed in under the Herodian platform. It was only during the late 8th century BCE, in the time of Hezekiah, that the southeastern ridge, together with the southwestern hill, was incorporated into the city and fortified. And now you will understand why here in the western part of the city of David there was never a wall. Because there was never a need to put a wall here, because when the city was grown up, was expanded from here, so both areas were surrounded by a wall, and the wall surrounded both hills. So here, you never needed a wall. In other words, in both the Iron Age to be and in the Hellenistic period, the expansion of Jerusalem to the south, the city of David, the southern ridge, and the southwest to the western wall took place at approximately the same time. This, in turn, is the reason why no fortification of this period has ever been found in the west of the city of David. Simply, there was no period when this was the outer line of the city, and therefore there was no need to fortify this place. The only ostensible difficulty with this scenario that I'm preparing now is the location of the spring, outside and relatively far away, about 300 meters from the city itself. This could have been compensated by water cisterns, that we have many of them on the Temple Mount, and by a system of, that I have to tell you about it because this is something that we do now. What we can see in many other cities, and I want to show you, some pictures that I added. All cities in the world were built on the top of the mount. This is, for example, the city of Lachish. This is the way that we reconstruct Lachish. And again, this is the top of the mount that can be surrounded by wall, and the water is outside, down the hill somewhere. This is, for example, the city of Bet Shemesh, and the water system is outside, not in the city itself, not on the top of the hill. This is Gat of the Philistines, and again, the city itself is on the hill, and the water, this is the hill, and the water is outside. So it's not only Jerusalem. This was the problem of every city in the world. This is, for example, a city that was built in Samaria, and the water is outside, somewhere low in the other side, because again, water is never on the top of the mound. This is nature of water, as you know. So we can see it in Turkey, in cities that we have in Turkey and in Syria. We can see it everywhere. Now, the problem is how to get to the water. And this is the most fascinating thing in every city, because in every city, they invested a lot of efforts to get to the water. So, for example, this is the city of Gibeon. They just dug a very, very deep pit inside the city, and then they had a tunnel going from the below this pit, going and getting to the water. We have it in Gezer. We have it in every city in the world. We have, this is Megiddo. In every place you have this attempt to get in a secret way to the water. So why not to find it in Jerusalem? The problem is, of course, how you can find it in Jerusalem when the city of Jerusalem is a place that you cannot actually excavate. So I can tell you that in the last year, we have a project that we are trying to detect the secret entrances to the water system and the underground tunnel and channel that we have in Jerusalem by cosmic ray. Now, I want to tell you about it. We have in Israel a department in physics that developed detectors for cosmic ray. Muons. Muons are very small parts that in every second, on every square meters, you have 12 muons falling from the sky, crossing the building, crossing your body, getting to the ground, and getting something like 200 meters down until they stop because they cannot go too far inside. So our friend in the physics, they developed a muon detectors that can see that a muon is hitting them. And then they developed a system of some detectors, one below the other, that can see that the muon is coming here and here and here and here and here, and they can calculate what is the speed of the muons and what is the angle of the muons. Because if they are here, they'll be here, 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 here. And then they have very strong computers that are calculating the speed and the angle. Now, what happened to the muons when they hit the ground? They stop slowly, 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 they stop. So what we are doing, we put the muon detectors above the ground, and we put the muon detectors very deep in all kinds of ditches that we have below the city itself, in the Kidron Valley, and in all kinds of other places. And we see the difference between this detector and this detector, and then we can calculate what happened to the muons if they are hitting the ground, but what happened to the muons that are hitting shafts or caves or hollow spaces, and they are not stopped in the way that they are. And now we have projects that we already have 3 detectors. We need 12. And we need it for many months because the calculation. And I can tell you that not in so long time that we will find where are the secret systems that connect the top of the hill where the city was and the spring down there. I have one clue for this, that I know that it's there because 5 years ago, there was a huge sewage pump that exploded to the north of the ancient city of Jerusalem, near the Rockefeller Museum. After 24 hours, the sewage started to be in the Gihon Spring. So something is connecting this area here with the spring over here, and we just need to find it. Let me summarize what I think is the problem, or what I think is the situation. For hundreds of years, people lived among the ruins of the Iron Age city of Jerusalem. The few hundred people of the Persian and early Hellenistic periods lived around the temple and the Gihon spring between the ruined buildings of the large Iron Age city, and couldn't ignore the size and the strength of the remains in the western hill, in the ridge of the city of David, and maybe also in and around the Temple Mount. I think that this is the source for the descriptions and the longings and the hopes that we all can see in the biblical description, and maybe we all can hope for the Messiah that will come and will build again the glorious Jerusalem of the biblical time. The tension between the very poor and small settlement in the Persian and early Hellenistic period and the remains of the destroyed large city in the western hill, in the city of David and the Temple Mount, must be understood as the forcing power behind the descriptions on the past and the longing to the great old days of Jerusalem as the capital of the Davidic kingdom. The image of Jerusalem affected generations of scholars who came to the city when the Herodian temple above the remains of the city are the most dominant structure, shaping the view of all the city and its surroundings. The impact of the image of the glorious city in the biblical scriptures, together with the presence of the Herodian temple, shaped the reconstruction of archaeologists and historians, as well as biblical scholars that investigate the city and gave their interpretations to the facts they found. Unlike any other city in the Levant, Jerusalem got the image, size, and actual reconstructions based on the biblical image of it, and this image is still protecting the symbolic Jerusalem from the real reconstructions of its past. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Oded, for your very nice and thought-provoking lecture, which for sure raises a lot of questions and comments and so on. So
I hope that not stones or tomatoes.
No.
Question is okay.
Nyní je čas tedy diskutovat. Máme na to 25-30 minut, podle toho, jak nám tady hostitelé řeknou. A otázky je možné mikrofon, že? Do mikrofonu buď česky nebo anglicky, jak budete chtít. Tak prosím.
I think that all people convinced.
Prosím vás, tvrdí tady přednášející, že jste určitě přesvědčeni.
I will add one more thing, until you are thinking about questions. Look, in many cases, when I'm talking about these things with colleagues, scholars of Bible, archaeology, history, American scholars, German scholars, Czech scholars, they always say, how can it be that the Bible was written in such a poor place? How can it be that, 200, 250 people in Jerusalem with their families, okay, 1,000, but kids, and 250 people that lived in Jerusalem for most of its periods, This is the group who wrote the Bible. How can it be? The Bible should be written in a big city, in a rich, and I think no. The Bible was written in a small community of people that lived not in the city, they lived in the text. They lived with the scrolls. They lived thinking about the past, hoping for the future, and they had a very poor present. And the poor present, when people are living in this poor present, among the ruins from the past, with hopes for the future, this is the fuel for the biblical literature. This is the reason why the biblical was so, the scrolls were so important, why the Bible is so important. So I think that vice versa. I think that text, especially the biblical text, is not connected to rich society, is not connected to people who lived in big palaces. Go to Qumran, see, the scrolls of Qumran, who wrote it in what small community. Go to the Middle Ages monasteries where the texts were written in the Middle Ages, not in the rich, places. So I think that this should change our thoughts about how the Bible was created, and for me at least, it makes the Bible even more important than, I thought previously. So this is another dimension that I think we should take in mind when we read the biblical text and when we think about biblical Jerusalem.
Mikrofon tam, prosím. Asi anglicky teda.
Thank you very much for your lecture. You made a maneuver moving the Jerusalem to the north from the today what we call city of David to the temple area, more or less. Do you expect to be a temple there? Was there a temple in pre-Sancherib time? You also were involved in the excavations of Tel Motza. So there is a temple 7 kilometers from there. Couldn't we reckon with a scenario that it was only after Sancherib that a temple appeared in the temple area of today? Wouldn't you?
I think that very different from what you think. I think the temple was essential part of every small city that we had in the ancient Near East. We excavated in Azekah a temple. So a small place with a temple, everyone needs, I don't have to say it here, everyone needs a place to pray. Everyone needs a priest to get blessed from. Everyone needs it. It's something essential with many people, at least in the ancient world. So I think that unlike what we can think from the biblical text, there was only one temple in Jerusalem, I think that every city in the ancient Near East had a temple. And the fact that we excavated together with our Czech colleagues a temple in a small town 7 kilometers from Jerusalem, a temple that was built in the same time that, according to the Bible, the temple in Jerusalem was built. And if you read in the Bible how the temple in Jerusalem was looked like, this is exactly what we excavated in Motza. The same size, the same direction, east-west, the same structure of the temple. So a similar temple to what we have in Jerusalem, according to the biblical text, we had in Motza 7 kilometers from Jerusalem. So why not to think that in Gibeon, to the north of Jerusalem, there was a temple. In Bethel, to the north of Jerusalem, there was a temple. In Motza, to the southwest of Jerusalem, there was a temple. Every place where you had a community of about 200, 250 families, you had a temple. And people knew how a temple should look like. The only manipulation that the people in Jerusalem made towards the end of the first temple period was to say that, okay, you can have many temples, and they admit that you had many temples, but only one temple is the real temple, and only one temple is the legitimate temple by God. But probably the people in Motza thought that, okay, maybe there is only one temple that should be, but it's our temple. And maybe the people in Gibeon thought that it's our temple. So the fact that we believe that only one temple is the right temple is because the people of Jerusalem wrote the biblical text that we have. So we have their own opinion. But the fact that in Moza we excavate a temple that existed during all the first temple period of Jerusalem. So near Jerusalem there was another temple, exactly the same one. So what? The people in Moza thought that the only real temple is in Jerusalem? No, they had their own temple. So when the political power of the kings in Jerusalem became stronger, so the temple in Jerusalem became stronger. And maybe according to the ideology in Jerusalem, the only real temple should be in Jerusalem. But this is the opinion of the Jerusalemites, and this is how I started my lecture. The text was written by Jerusalemites, for Jerusalemites, and it represents the ideology of Jerusalemites. So this is what we have. If we had a Bible written by the people in Moza, it was a different Bible, I think.
Další otázka, tamhle. Pan rektor ve výslužbě.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I'm not a biblical scientist at all, but I think what you are talking about has a big political implications. With Jerusalem and Jerusalem temple area being the center point for at least three large religions and lots of political connections to it. Could you comment on this? What could be the implications for this? Cannot research like this relieve us from the permanent tensions between these three directions on this particular spot on the surface of our earth?
Again, I think in a different way. I think that if you think about this small Jerusalem and this small temple that was in Jerusalem, you should understand that we should disconnect richness of material culture and big populations to importance of religion and theology. I told some people here that me and my wife, we live in the Galilee of Israel. We live very, very close to Nazareth. And we have 4 kids. And with small kids, you have to go with them all the time. So we are going from our home to Santa Ana. And we tell the kids about, the history of Jesus and his mother. And we go to Nazareth and we show the house in Nazareth of Jesus. We go to Kfar Kana and we told the story about Jesus and the wine and the water. And we are going to the Sea of Galilee and to Beit Saida, and we tell stories about, Jews that lived in the area that we live 2,000 years ago. And then in 2002, we moved to Germany to my postdoctoral. And we arrived in the first day to Germany, and we go with our car to the guest house of the University of Heidelberg. And we see a church here, and a church here, and a church here, and a church here. In all the churches, what you have Jesus outside on the cross. And we hear our son, second son, he was then 9 years old, telling to his brother, who was then 13 years old, he's telling him, this Jesus, our neighbor from the Galilee, he is so famous here in Germany. So, the gap between the original characters of David as a person, of Solomon as a person, of Josiah as a person, and of Jesus as a person, I think that we should disconnect it from the religious impact of these people in later generations. And I think that vice versa. You don't need to be strong and rich in order to be important religious person. And again, I think that if you think about it in this way, it's not causing you to be less religion. I think it's causing you to be more religion, if you want. It's not causing you to say bad things about biblical characters, from David to Jesus, to Muhammad, if you want. But you understand the historical way that people became such an important religious figures in later generations. And you understand how shaping characters and how texts are created and how it's important to people that they will have what to believe in. And I think that religious leaders of these days, and I met today some of them, have the same role. Not to make Jesus or David or Moses or Muhammad. Not to make it so disconnected from the original life that he had. And this is why I'm encouraging people to come to excavate with us. Because you're coming to excavate with us in Tel Azekah, the place where David and Goliath had their own battle. And you see the actual houses of these people. And you see the cooking pots that they cook their meals. And you see the candles that they had the light at night. And you see the destruction, horrible destructions. And you see the dead people there from different periods. And you see how history is becoming, from early periods to late periods, and how people lived in the Holy Land. And I think that when you understand the gap that I try to show here regarding Jerusalem, but we can talk about the gap between historical Jesus and Jesus of the New Testament, between historical Muhammad and the figure of Muhammad in different sects of Muslims. I think that it's making us, first of all, better people, and then better believers, if it's important for you to be one of them. And I think that to go in the extreme way on not trying to think about the real life of these holy people, not to think about the life that they had before, I think this is what makes us all living in a crazy world, like, I'm coming from Israel now, like we have now. So this is my answer to you. As one of who excavated with us, so.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have maybe more methodological, practical questions. So you mentioned this fancy machine for the stardust, right? And how it could be useful for possibly detecting these underground structures under the Temple Mount. Oh. And you also said that we have indirect evidence from the Rockefeller Museum and how it got to the Kidron Valley. But I think that we actually know about that there is some underground structures. There was this Charles Warren's survey in the 19th century who discovered there were quite deep structures with some cistern. Yeah. But he connected it to the second temple, the Herodian temple. So he said that the cistern there, quite deep, huge cistern under the Temple Mount, is there actually, but it was built as a part of a temple structure of Herod to run the business around the altar. So my question is that if you collect all the stardust and you get all these shafts from that, how you methodologically can discern that this is something coming from the Iron Age and not from the Herodian structure?
Okay, thank you for the very practical. You brought us, back to the practical side. So what we have is we have many tunnels and channels and all kinds of installations around the spring. So it's clearly that you had connections from the spring above. What we don't have is any connection that we know that it should be there. I know. Between the Temple Mount and this area of the city of David. Like we have in Megiddo, like we know that we have it in Azekah, but we don't excavate it because it's a big project. Like we have in Hatzor, if you've been there. Like we have in Gibeon, like we have in every city. Now, the difference between Azekah and Jerusalem is that in Azekah it's a matter of decision of the excavators and the money, because it's a lot of work. In Jerusalem, even if you have decision, I don't want to be part of the decision because it's a political thing. And it's not practical because you cannot excavate under the Temple Mount. I don't want to think about excavation under the Temple Mount. And down the city because people are living there. And I will never excavate under houses of people. So, first of all, what I'm saying is let's find out if you have it and where it is. And this is what these detectors can give us and lead us to. Then, we can start thinking if we can get to it, how we can get to it. Maybe we can get to from below, maybe we can do, but first let's detect it. So for us, it's a practical thing. For the physicians, for the people of the physics, it's, it makes them, they came first with a very big machine. Then we told them, listen, you cannot put this big machine in a cave, below the Giron because it's too big. And you don't have electricity for it. So they built a machine that is so small they sent it in a satellite, to the area of God over there. So it was there. And now we have these machines that we can operate, like in the satellites, but also below the ground. And the only problem is that every one of these machines costs $100,000 and we need 12. So it's money. So until now we have 2. And we moved 1, so we have 3. But this is why it will take us more time, because we are moving them from every 3, 4, 5 months. When we have the data, we are moving them. But what I'm saying, let's first know if we have them and where they are. Then we can think about the next step, if. And the fact that I will have the information and not a fanatic Jew, Muslim, or Christian, it means that we are not going to do anything that will harm Jews, Muslims, or Christians. So we will try to be moderate and not harm living people for any information about the past. As long as I can manage it. So.
Tak, další dotaz.
So what we have is that all of you are coming to excavate with us, and all of you are convinced about Jerusalem, and you have no more questions.
Tady, Jan.
We have one.
Thank you. Just a very a simple question about clarification of the chronology. I'm quite convinced by your theory about the original sites, just because it seems to make sense in general terms. But how would you date it? I mean, that should mean that was the original Jebusite, or how would you call it, settlement that was then conquered by David.
Yeah.
And how long did it last before it was expanded into these sort of southern east?
Good question. I will try to make some order. The reconstruction that I have is that in the Middle Bronze, around 1800 BC, where all the ancient cities in the Levant started to be built and fortified, also a city was built on the top of the mount below the Haram al-Sharif over there. This is why we have no remains from this Middle Bronze, and only what we have is some sherds that had the slope, from the Middle Bronze, from the top of the mount down there. This city continued to be in the late Bronze, in the, let's say, 15, 14, 1300s BC. And again, what we have is that below this hill, on the slope of it, we have some remains of pottery. We even have one piece of a letter from El Amarna that was found that was falling down from the slope. Between the late Bronze and the early Iron Age, in the time before the time of David and Solomon, probably the city was there, because I think that we cannot doubt that David conquered the city, Solomon built the temple on the Temple Mount, and the city continued. By the way, if you read the description of the city of David, so this city of David was a city with Jebusites and Hittites and many other people that lived in this Davidic city when he conquered it. For example, he bought the place of the temple from a guy named Aravna the Jebusite that was there. David saw Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, when she was married to Uriah the Hittite, before she married. So there were many different people over there. And they lived in Jerusalem for the next 200 years until around late 800 BC, towards the middle of the 8th century, let's say 750 BC. And then, from the city on the top of the mount, that it became more crowded and more big, people needed more space, so they started to go from the top of the mount to the city of David, to the ridge above the Gihon spring, and to the western hill, where we have today the Jewish and the Armenian quarter. And around 720, 730, this area was surrounded by a wall that is surrounded the two hills together, connected to the Temple Mount. And then the temple...
You do know about that wall? It was discovered? Or?
Yes, this wall was discovered in the eastern side of the city of David and in the western side of the Jewish quarter area. So it's clear. The only thing, there was no wall in between them because there was no need to. And this city is the city that was destroyed by the Babylonians after 130, 40 years that it existed. And then again, in the Persian period, in the time of the return from the exile, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the city was again shrunk to the Temple Mount, around the temple, around the houses over there. It was a small city. And only after the revolt of the Maccabees, when Jerusalem became again a big city, again the population went down to the city of David and to the Western Court. Here we even have more nice information. For example, in all these areas, in the city of David and in the hill of the Jewish quarter, they found many houses from the late second, from the time of the Hasmoneans, with Herodian amphora. It means amphora that wine was imported from Rhodus, from Rhodes. Now, the good thing is that on these amphora, people in the Hellenistic time, they like to have good wine. So on the amphora, they have inscriptions about where the wine came from, who is the producer, like we have tags on wine, and what is the date. So you don't want to drink wine not from good year. So they have the date. So we have hundreds of amphoras from the area, so we can see very clearly what is the date of this wine. It's interesting because according to Jewish law, Jews shouldn't drink wine that was produced by Gentiles, but we have it all over. So they drank. Good wine, never mind who is producing it, it's good wine. And then the city expanded even more in the Roman period until Herod the Great decided to build this huge temple on the area above them. Now we know from the stories, in the Flavius Josephus and other, that the Jews didn't believe Herod that he will build this third temple because he needed to clear the top of the hill where all the houses and the second temple from the Persian period was built. So he brought all the woods and all the stones and he prepared all the material to build this huge compound before the Jews let him clear the hill and build the temple. And now we know from archaeology that Herod started to build it, but didn't finish. Because under the walls of the Western Wall, we have coins from around 40 AD. So the compound of the Herodian temple was not finished by Herod, but it was finished around 40, maybe more AD. And it means that the third temple, this huge complex, was not functioning more than 30 years before the Romans came and destroyed it. And this is the time that Jerusalem started to be a Roman, and then, you know, the rest of the history, that it's already different history from the first and second history. So this is the way that I reconstruct it. And I think that when you see the find, it's so logical. But when you see the biblical text, so you can see that scholars are still fighting with the image of Jerusalem and not describing the history of Jerusalem as I think it should be reconstructed.
Thank you.
Možná ještě poslední otázka. Tam.
Hello, Oded. I would like to ask you about Moza.
About the?
Moza. When you finished the excavations last year, as you told, give you an idea, why was the size exactly the same size as the Solomon's temple? Was it some competition between Jerusalem or Moza, or is a possibility that in Israel exist more temples of the same size? Because the others are smaller than the Moza temple.
Yeah. So the plan of the temple that we have in Moza, which is exactly like the plan of the Solomonic temple according to the description in the Book of Kings, is what we say the anti-antique temple that we know from all the area of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, already from the 12th century BC, 11th, 10th. We have many temples that were built according to this plan. East-west, with three main structures, with the Holy of Holies, in the western inner side. And so it was a well-known plan, and probably the dimensions were quite common. So even if it's not by the meter, people had the same ratio, the same size approximately, with the same plan. The interesting thing is how people in a small community in the Moza area or in Jerusalem area that were very isolated, how did they know how a temple should look like? So this is interesting, how they should know how a cult should be. Because in Moza, we have from the very early period, we have animal bones that were cut according to what we see later in biblical laws, how you should cut the animals and sacrifice them on the temple. We find all the remains of the cult. So there were tradition of how you should worship gods. By the way, different gods. What was the name of the god in Moza is a big question. What was the name of the god in Jerusalem? It's a big question. If you think about it, what was the god in Jerusalem in the time of David and Solomon? Do you have any idea which god they had in Jerusalem in this time? Because the name of Jerusalem in Hebrew is the foundation, Yeru, of the god Shalem. This is the name of the ancient god of Jerusalem. Now, if you think about David, his son, his favorite first son was Absalom. So my father is the god Shalem. The son that became afterwards a king is Solomon, which is Shalem. So who was the god in the time of David in Jerusalem? And this temple that was functioning in Jerusalem in the time of Shalem, Shlomo, and in Moza, which god was there in this time? And when Yahweh became the main god in this place, it's a big question. So what I'm thinking is that unlike what we can think from a very clear reading in the Bible, that God was always there and the temple were clear, I think that the situation is much more complicated. And you have different temples and you have different gods, and it took a lot of time of evolution until the biblical way of describing the cult, the god, the history was settled. And now we read the biblical text and we think that, okay, this is how it was written, this is how it was. But I don't think so. I think it took a lot of time and change until it was crystallized. And in a very late period, it was crystallized. And the history is much more complicated, and the evolution was much more complicated than we can think. And archaeology and history makes it really interesting to try to understand it. So Moza is not an isolated temple, and Jerusalem was not an isolated temple, and we had many other temples, and we also had other plans of temple, like we have in Moza, in Azekah. In Azekah, we have different temples than we have in Moza in Jerusalem. So again, things were much more complicated.
So when are you awaiting some conclusions, based on the radiocarbon methods?
In Moza? Oh, we are working on it very hard, and publications are coming.
Yeah.
And we have a carbon-14, and we have a lot of studies, and we are publishing things. We hope to publish the final publication of Moza very soon, and maybe then to come back to Moza and excavate the houses, because the temple is a temple. By mistake, by chance we found it, but there was a village around it with houses. So maybe after publishing the temple, we can go and excavate the houses around the temple that we can excavate. So, we need patience, and we need hard work, and then things will come.
Thank you very much for everything. Hi.
Dobře, tak to asi je čas pomalu ukončit tu debatu. Já předtím, než poděkuju našemu milému hostovi, tak trošku taková reklama, kterou máte na těch pracovních listech, ti, co si je vzali do ruky. Kdybyste se chtěli něco dozvědět víc k Jeruzalému, tak vyšly na konci minulého roku a letos náhodou dvě důležité knihy. A sice první, chronologicky v roce 2023 od Andrew Lowera, kniha Co skrývá Jeruzalém, pohřbená historie nejvíce znesvářeného města světa, nakladatelství Maraton. Doporučuji. Je to k dějinám hodně těch vykopávek a i těch různých kontroverzí, včetně i politických implikací a toho, co třeba byste se báli zeptat českých médií. Takže to tam najdete. Zajímavý. Druhá kniha, ještě zajímavější, je od Maxe Kichlera, což je jeden bych řekl, z posledních žijících evropských polyhistorů, který rozumí od numizmatiky přes jazyky až nevím kam. A vydal knížku, která se jmenuje Příručka a kulturně historický průvodce svatým městem. To slovo příručka je zavádějící, protože ta kniha má 865 stran. Stojí to, Davide, že 995 korun, takže lehce pod 1000. A je to vůbec nejlepší, si myslím, publikace k dějinám Jeruzaléma. Tady akademie a myslím, že tak před měsícem. Takže na to jsem chtěl jenom upozornit, kdybyste se chtěl něco dozvědět a nezaslechl jste o tom ještě něco dneska. Okay.
He's not talking about it, so I want to talk that it's not only we that excavate and publish things. So I was so happy to see Philip's new book about temples in transformation. And he collected large material on the temples in the Iron Age, compare it to the textual tradition. So the impact of the archaeology and the theology and the biblical text is around the globe, and you have here in Prague one of the experts in this subject. So we will not be rich, but the book is here. So, and it's an important one. So also Philip, dear colleagues, who is working hard on this subject. So you should know it as well.
Yeah, and I think most of it, what's inside, is thanks to discussion and involvement and many years spent in dust with Odtud. Sometimes also at some conferences, but mostly in the dust, in the so-called Holy Land. So Odtud, thank you very much for being with us and with your family. Přeji pěkný večer a ještě děkujeme znovu Dominikánské 8, že jsme tady mohli s vámi být. Erev tov.
Platforma Dominikánská 8 se bez vaší podpory neobejde. Pokud vám naše činnost připadá smysluplná, pomůže nám i 20 korun za shlédnutí videa. Předem vám děkujeme.